Have you ever stood in a room full of people who were supposed to be your family and realized, all at once, that not one of them was going to fight for you? Cassie Hartwell was 23 years old, and she was standing in exactly that room. It was a lawyer's office in Willow Bend, Nebraska, with a window air conditioner that rattled every few minutes like it was clearing its throat, and a folder in front of her, with her name misspelled on the tab. Cassie Hartwell, not Hartwill, not Harwell, but the paralegal had typed it wrong, and nobody had bothered to fix it, which felt, in that moment, like a fairly accurate summary of her place in this family. Her grandfather, Walter Whitfield, was 3 weeks in the ground. He had raised her mother, and after her mother died when Cassie was 9, he'd let Cassie keep his last name on her school papers, even though nothing on paper made her a Whitfield at all. She was a step-granddaughter, an add-on, a Christmas dinner obligation. And sitting across the table from her were his 2 actual grandsons, Trent and Dale, both of them in pressed shirts, both of them already talking about the equipment auction before the will had even been read. She had $81 in her checking account and a car that needed brakes. She wasn't here for money. She was here because some small, stubborn part of her still wanted to be told she'd mattered to him. What she didn't expect was for the answer to come wrapped in something the rest of the family would spend the next hour laughing about. The lawyer, a tired man named Feld who'd clearly done this 100 times, read through the land first. 410 acres of prime corn ground, split evenly between Trent and Dale. Then the equipment. Then the farmhouse itself, deeded to Dale since he had the growing family. Trent got the pickup trucks and the mineral rights. It went on for a while, line by line, the estate of a man who had built something real out of Nebraska dirt over 60 years. And then Feld got to the last item, and he actually cleared his throat before he read it, like he already knew how it would land. To my granddaughter Cassie, who never once asked me for anything, I leave the old grain silo on the South 40 and the 1 acre of ground it sits on. For a second, nobody said anything. Then Trent laughed. Not cruel exactly, just careless. The way you laugh at something that doesn't cost you anything to find funny. The silo, he said, shaking his head. Grandpa Walt giving away real estate right to the end. Dale didn't even look up from his phone. You can have the silo, he said. We'll take the rest. Nobody in that room, not Trent, not Dale, not even the lawyer shuffling his papers to move on to the next item, had any idea what Walter Whitfield had actually just given away. Stick around, because by the end of this one, you'll understand exactly why he waited until the very last line of that will to say it. The drive out to the South 40 took 11 minutes from town, past soybean fields gone gold with the last of September, past a church with a marquee that still read Happy Easter from 6 months back, because nobody had gotten around to changing it. Cassie drove with the windows down. The air smelled like cut hay and diesel, and underneath that, the particular mineral smell of a Nebraska evening about to turn cold. The silo sat alone at the edge of what used to be pasture land, a squat concrete tower gone grey with age, its metal cap rusted the color of an old penny. Nobody had used it to store grain in at least 15 years. Her grandfather had switched to selling straight off the combine sometime in her childhood, and the silo had just stood there ever since, a monument to nothing, filled with whatever silence collects in a building nobody needs. She parked the car in the weeds and sat there a moment before getting out. Her hands, she noticed, were shaking a little, not from cold. The door, if you could call it that, a rust-caked slab of corrugated steel on a track, didn't want to move. She had to throw her whole 130 pounds into it before it screamed sideways an inch, then 2, then far enough to slip through. Inside, the air was cool and close, and smelled like old grain dust and wet stone, and dim grey light fell in stripes, through gaps in the roof panels far overhead. Something skittered in the shadows along the base, and she froze, heart going hard, before deciding not to think too closely about what it had been. She had nowhere else to be. That was the truth of it, plain and a little embarrassing. Her lease in Lincoln was up at the end of the month, and she hadn't renewed it, because renewing it would have meant admitting she was staying in a job stocking shelves at a feed store for $9.40 an hour with no clear next step. She'd told herself she was waiting to see what the will said. Now she knew. She had a silo. It should have felt like nothing. It should have felt, honestly, like an insult, the same shape of insult Trent and Dale had been handing her, gently and without noticing, since she was 9 years old. "You can have the silo. We'll take the rest." But standing there in the dust-fogged light, running her palm along the cool, curved concrete, Cassie found herself thinking about something small and strange. Her grandfather had never once, in 14 years, mentioned this silo to her. Not one story about it, not one comment while they drove past it on the way to check the far fence line. He'd talked about nearly everything else on this farm. The year the flood took the lower field, the tractor he'd bought second-hand in '81 and never trusted since, the fence post that marked where his own father was buried before they moved the family plot into town. He talked about all of it, except this. And now here it was, sitting alone on an acre he'd carved out and left to her, specifically, by name, in the very last line of his will. She walked the inside perimeter slowly. The old grain chute hung crooked from one wall. A ladder, rusted nearly solid, climbed up into the dark toward the roof, and near the base, half buried under decades of settled dust and mouse leavings, she found something that made her stop entirely. A section of the concrete floor that didn't match the rest. Slightly darker, slightly newer. A rough rectangle, maybe 4 feet by 3, patched in at some point long after the original pour. She crouched down and pressed her hand flat against it. Cool, solid, ordinary. In every way a slab of concrete is ordinary. Except her grandfather had never patched a single thing on this farm without telling somebody about it first. Outside, the light was going soft and orange, and somewhere down the gravel road a truck downshifted, slowing. Cassie stayed crouched over that patched square of floor a moment longer, feeling something she hadn't let herself feel in the lawyer's office. Not disappointment, not humiliation at being handed the joke of the estate. Curiosity. She didn't know yet that the truck slowing down on the road belonged to a man named Ross Calder, who had worked this farm alongside her grandfather for 11 years, and who was about to become the first person to tell her that this silo had a story nobody in the family had ever wanted to hear. The truck was an old blue Ford, dented along one panel, and it pulled off the gravel road and rolled to a stop right at the edge of the weeds, without Cassie having to wave it down. A man climbed out, 60-some years old, weathered the way men get, who've spent their whole lives outdoors, wearing a canvas coat, despite the evening still holding some warmth. He had a limp in his left leg that showed only when he first stepped down, then worked itself out after a few strides. "Your waltz girl," he said. Not a question. Cassie. She stood up from the crouch she'd been in, brushing dust off her jeans. "I'm sorry, I don't—" Ross Calder. "Worked this ground with your grandfather going on 11 years, up until his hip gave out on him 2 years back, and he couldn't keep up with me no more." A faint, dry smile. That's what he told folks anyway. Truth is, I think he just liked having somebody to argue with about crop rotation. Cassie found herself smiling despite everything. The lawyer's office, the drive out here, the strange square of newer concrete she'd been running her palm over a minute before. "He mentioned me. Ever?" Ross's smile faded into something more careful. "More than you'd think." "Not to your cousins. To me." He nodded toward the silo behind her, its rusted door still gaping open. He know you got this? I found out an hour ago. Ross was quiet a moment, looking past her at the structure, like he was seeing something in it that wasn't just concrete and rust. Well, he said finally, that's something then. Something like what? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked past her, into the silo's cool, dim interior, moving with the easy familiarity of a man who'd been in this exact spot 100 times before. He crouched, slower than she had, favoring the bad hip, right over the same patched square of floor she'd found. He redid this section himself, Ross said. Fall of, must have been 11 years back now. Told me not to help him. Told me not to ask why. I figured it was just settling. Silos crack, floors shift. No mystery in that. He looked up at her. But your grandfather wasn't a man who spent a Saturday alone doing work he could have had help with, unless there was a reason he didn't want anybody watching. Cassie felt something tighten low in her chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition, maybe, of a feeling she'd carried her whole life without a name for it. The sense of being kept just outside of something. Did you ever ask him again, later, once? Ross straightened up, wincing slightly. Years after, we were splitting a six-pack on his porch, and I asked him straight out what he'd buried under his own silo floor. You know what he told me? What? He said, Ross, some things you don't dig up till you're ready to carry what's under 'em. Then he changed the subject to the Huskers and wouldn't hear another word about it. Ross shook his head, something soft moving behind his eyes. I let it go. Wasn't my business. But I never forgot it either. Cassie looked down at the patched concrete again. 4 feet by 3. Ordinary in every way, except that it wasn't. I don't even own a sledgehammer, she said, half to herself. I've got 2, Ross said. But you're not doing anything to that floor tonight. It's near dark. You look like you haven't eaten since this morning. And there's things you ought to know about this place before you go swinging anything at it. Like what? Like the fact that this silo's been sitting on a full acre your grandfather kept off every survey he ever filed for 40 years. Trent and Dale think you got a rusted tin can and some dirt. They don't know the acre's never once shown up on a county plat since 1979. He said it plainly, like a man laying cards on a table he'd been holding a long while. Your grandfather was careful. Everything he did on purpose. That includes leaving this to you, and leaving it to you last, after everybody else already had theirs. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose roof panel somewhere above them, and Cassie pulled her jacket tighter without quite deciding to. Why me? She asked. Why not one of them? Ross considered the question longer than she expected. You want the honest answer, or the polite one? Honest. Because you're the only one of his grandkids who ever came out here just to sit with him. Trent and Dale came for holidays, for the truck when they turned 16, for money when the crop insurance paid out big. You came because you liked the quiet. He shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world. Man notices that. Especially a man who spent 60 years building something nobody in his own family seemed to want to understand. It was the kind of thing that could have made her cry, standing there in a dead silo with a stranger who wasn't really a stranger at all, except she was too tired and too raw and too many hours removed from the lawyer's office to let herself. Instead, she just nodded, once, and looked back down at the concrete. You said there's things I ought to know about the place. There's plenty, Ross said. But it's getting on toward dark, and you don't strike me as the type who's slept in a car before, so I'm guessing you don't have anywhere lined up in town tonight. She hadn't thought that far. She hadn't thought past see what the will says, and now the will had said its piece and left her standing in the one place nobody wanted, with $81 and a stranger's kindness, the only 2 things standing between her and sleeping in her car. "I don't," she admitted. It cost her something to say it. "My wife Dottie's got a spare room and a soft spot for strays," Ross said, already turning toward his truck. "Don't argue with me about it. You can start tearing up concrete tomorrow, in daylight. When you're not so tired, you'll put a sledgehammer through your own foot." Cassie hesitated at the silo's rusted door, looking back once more into the dark. The patched square of floor had gone nearly invisible in the fading light. Just a shape in the shadow now, one more secret in a building full of them. Somewhere above, in the crossbeams near the roof, something shifted and settled with a soft metallic groan, like the whole structure was exhaling after holding something in for a very long time. "Ross," she said. "Who else knew about this? About him doing work out here alone?" He paused halfway into the truck, and for just a second, brief enough that she almost missed it, something crossed his face that looked less like memory and more like caution. "There was a fella used to come around sometimes, years back, before your time maybe. Called himself Walt's cousin, though I never did get the story straight on that." Ross climbed in and started the engine, raising his voice over the rattle of the old diesel. Man showed up maybe 4-5 times over the years. Always left looking like he and your grandfather had words. Never did catch his name proper. Walt just called him the cousin and left it there. "Is he still around?" "Couldn't tell you," Ross said. "Nobody's seen him in years. But your grandfather kept a strong box of letters in his study he never once let anybody read. And if I had to bet on who half of them were written to, I wouldn't bet against that cousin." He nodded toward the passenger seat. "Get in. You've got a long day tomorrow, and I got a feeling this is only the start of what that silo's got waiting on you." Dottie Calder turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman who fed Cassie a plate of chicken and dumplings before asking a single question about why she'd shown up on their porch with her stepbrother's name still bitter in her mouth. It was only after the dishes were cleared that she set a cup of coffee in front of Cassie and said, plainly, "Ross tells me you got the silo." "I got the silo," Cassie agreed. "Good," Dottie said, and left it at that, which was somehow more comforting than anything the lawyer had managed to say all afternoon. Cassie slept that night in a guest room that smelled like cedar and old quilts, and she didn't sleep well, not because the bed was uncomfortable, but because her mind kept circling back to a 4x3 patch of concrete and a man Ross had called the cousin, a man who left arguing with her grandfather more than once and who nobody had seen in years. She was up before 6. Ross was already at the kitchen table with coffee and a road map spread out that had nothing to do with roads. It was a hand-drawn plat of the farm, decades old by the look of the paper, with the silo's acre marked in pencil at the southern edge, disconnected from the rest of the property lines around it, like an island. "Found this in my own files last night," Ross said. "Your grandfather gave me a copy back when we still worked together, so I could keep the fence lines straight. Didn't think much of it till last night." He tapped the marked square. "That acre's never been folded into any survey since '79. Which means legally, officially, on paper, it's about the most private piece of ground in this county." "Private for what?" Ross didn't answer that. He just folded the map and handed it to her. "Sledgehammers are in the truck bed. Let's go find out." The drive back out to the silo felt different in morning light. The goldfields from yesterday evening had gone silver with dew, and a low fog sat in the low spots of the pasture, burning off slow under a sun that hadn't yet found its full strength. Cassie rode with the window cracked, letting the cold air wake her the rest of the way, and found herself, for the first time since the lawyer's office, feeling something close to steady. The silo door screamed sideways easier this time, already broken in from yesterday's fight. Inside, the morning light came down in cleaner stripes than the dusk had allowed, and the patched square of concrete looked exactly as ordinary and exactly as wrong as it had the evening before. Ross handed her a sledgehammer that was nearly as long as her torso. "You want the honor, or you want me to start?" "It's mine," Cassie said. "I'll start." The first swing jarred all the way up into her shoulders and did almost nothing but chip a white scar into the surface. The second did more. By the fifth, sweat had soaked through the back of her shirt despite the morning cold, and a fine web of cracks had started spidering out from the point of impact. Ross took over for a stretch, his bad hip clearly costing him something with every swing, though he didn't say so, and she didn't ask him to stop. It was nearly 40 minutes before the slab gave way all at once, a chunk the size of a dinner plate dropping down into a cavity beneath, and both of them froze at the sound. Not the crack of concrete, but a hollow, resonant thunk, the sound of something striking something that wasn't dirt. Cassie dropped to her knees and cleared the loose rubble with her bare hands, ignoring Ross telling her to slow down, to watch for glass or rebar, to let him get the flashlight from the truck first. Beneath the shattered concrete was a second layer, old wood, grey and swollen with decades of trapped moisture, boards laid over a rectangular pit maybe 3 feet deep. "There's something under the boards," she said, voice tight. Ross crouched beside her, flashlight now in hand, and together they pried up the first plank. It came away with a wet groan, releasing a smell of cold earth and old rust, and underneath, half sunk into packed dirt, sat the corner of something metal, green with age, riveted at the seams. "That's a footlocker," Ross said quietly, "military style. Man, I haven't seen one of these since my own daddy's things." It took another 20 minutes to clear enough boards to get real leverage on it, and even then the box didn't want to come free. Decades of settled earth had it gripped tight, and Cassie's fingers were raw and bleeding at the knuckles by the time it finally came loose with a sucking, reluctant sound, like the ground itself was letting go of something it had held onto too long. It was heavier than it looked. Locked, of course. A rusted padlock through a hasp, both fused nearly solid with age. But even lifting it told her something. It wasn't empty. Something inside shifted with a soft, dense weight, not the light rattle of tools or the hollow echo of nothing. "Don't open it here," Ross said, and something in his voice had gone careful in a way she hadn't heard from him yet. "Not out here in the open, not with that gravel road 20 yards off and half the county liable to drive by. Why not?" "Because your grandfather buried this on ground that doesn't exist on any survey, sealed it under a silo floor nobody was supposed to look under, and never told a soul but maybe one man who used to show up angry and leave angrier." Ross wiped his hands on his jeans, looking down at the box like it might still bite him. "That tells me whatever's in there, he didn't want found by accident. I'd rather you open it somewhere you can shut a door behind you first." Cassie looked down at the footlocker, dirt-crusted and dented, sitting in the wreckage of the floor her grandfather had patched alone, on purpose, without telling anyone why. She thought about the letter. There had to be a letter, didn't there? Some explanation, the way these things always seem to come with an explanation, in the stories her grandmother used to tell about the Depression years. And she thought about the cousin Ross had mentioned, the one who left arguing more than once. "Ross," she said, "yesterday you said he kept a strong box of letters in his study. The ones you thought might be to the cousin." "That's right. Is that strong box still there, at the house?" Ross's jaw tightened slightly. "Should be. Far as I know, Trent and Dale haven't started clearing the place out yet. Lawyer told them not to touch personal effects till probate closes." He looked at her for a long moment, like he was weighing something. "You're thinking there's a connection. I'm thinking my grandfather didn't do anything on this farm without a reason," Cassie said, echoing his own words back to him. "And I'm thinking, whoever that cousin was, he might be the reason this got buried, instead of just left to me plain," Like everything else. Ross hefted the footlocker into his arms with a grunt, careful of his hip, and started for the truck. Then I guess we've got two things to go dig into today, he said. This box, and whatever your grandfather wrote down and never sent. Behind them, the silo stood open to the morning light for the first time in over a decade, its ruined floor exposed, the old wood and broken concrete scattered like the shed skin of something that had finally, after 11 years, been allowed to come up for air. Cassie looked back at it once before climbing into the truck, and for reasons she couldn't quite name, she found herself thinking it looked less like an insult now than it had a day ago. It looked like it had been waiting for her. They didn't open the footlocker at the Calder place. Dottie took one look at the state of them, filthy, bloody-knuckled, hauling a rusted box between them like pallbearers, and declared that whatever was inside could wait the 20 extra minutes it took to drive into town and collect the strongbox from Walter's study first. "If there's a letter," Dottie said, in the tone of a woman who had clearly run this household's logic for 40 years, without much argument, "you'll want to read it before you go digging through what it's explaining. Otherwise, you're just guessing." Nobody argued with her. The farmhouse sat a mile and a half up the county road, white clapboard gone slightly grey at the edges, with a wraparound porch her grandfather used to sit on every evening, with a glass of iced tea he never finished. Cassie hadn't been inside since the funeral. Walking through the front door now, into a house that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and coffee, hit her harder than she expected. Harder, even, than the lawyer's office had. Trent's truck wasn't in the drive. Small mercy. Ross knew the house nearly as well as his own. He led her straight back to the study, a narrow room lined with farm ledgers and a single bookshelf of paperback westerns, and pointed to a low cabinet beneath the window. Bottom drawer. He kept it locked, but the key's on his ring, and I'm guessing, he crouched, feeling along the underside of the desk. Yeah. Spares taped right here. Man never trusted a lock he didn't have a backup key for. The strongbox was smaller than Cassie had pictured. A grey steel box no bigger than a shoebox, dented at one corner, with a simple keyed lock that gave way easily once Ross found the right key on the ring the lawyer's office had handed over that morning. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some still sealed in envelopes yellowed with age, others loose, folded and refolded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. Cassie's hands weren't steady as she lifted the top one out. The handwriting on the outside, for Cassie, when she's ready, stopped her cold. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew this would happen, that I'd end up here, going through this. Your grandfather," Ross said, "planned things about as far out as any man I ever met. Didn't surprise me one bit that he'd leave you a letter with your name already on it, sitting in a box he never opened for anybody else." She sat down in his old desk chair, worn smooth at the arms from 60 years of use, and unfolded the letter with the kind of care she'd have used on something that might crumble. The handwriting was shaky in places, stronger in others, like it had been written over more than one sitting. "Cassie, if you're reading this, it means I never found the nerve to explain it to you myself, and I expect you've already found the box under the silo, because you were always the one who paid attention to the things nobody else thought worth looking at. I want you to know before anything else, what's in that footlocker isn't the point of any of this. I know that's a strange thing to write, when I also know exactly what's in there, and I know what it'll mean to somebody starting out with nothing. But money was never the thing I wanted to leave you. I've had money before, and I've lost it before, and neither one ever taught me a single thing worth knowing. What I wanted to leave you was a reason to stay somewhere long enough to build something real, because I don't think anybody ever gave you that reason before. And God knows this family never made it easy. You'll have questions about the cousin. I expect Ross already told you there was one, because Ross never could keep a thing to himself past a six-pack. His name was Everett, and he was not my cousin at all. That's a lie I told so many times over so many years that it's near enough become the truth in my own head. I'll explain who he really was, and why I buried what I buried instead of just giving it to you plain, in the second letter, the one I've asked Ross to hold until you've had a few days to sit with the first. For now, just know this. The silo was never the worthless thing your brothers think it is. It was the only piece of this whole farm I ever built with my own hands, start to finish, no help from my father's money, and none from anyone else's. Every other acre on this place came down to me the easy way. That 1 acre I earned. And now it's yours. Earned the same way. The hard way. The way that actually means something. I'm sorry it took me dying to say any of this plainly. I was never much good at plain, when it mattered most. Cassie read it twice through before she trusted her voice enough to speak. When she looked up, Ross had gone quiet, standing near the window with his hands in his pockets, giving her the kind of space a man gives someone he respects too much to crowd. "There's a second letter," she said finally. "He says he asked you to hold it." Ross's expression shifted. Surprise, genuine and unguarded. "He never told me that. He said you'd have it, about someone named Everett." Ross was quiet a long moment, staring at nothing in particular, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rougher than before. "There was an envelope. Your grandfather gave it to me. Oh, must be 6-7 years back now. Told me to hold on to it and not open it, not for any reason. Until, and this is word for word, I remember it because it struck me odd at the time, until Cassie's dug up more than she bargained for." He shook his head slowly. "I put it in my own strongbox at home, and near enough forgot about it. Didn't think it'd ever actually come due. Can we get it? Today? We can." Ross glanced toward the window, where the light had shifted gold and long across the yard. Early afternoon already, the morning's work at the silo feeling like it belonged to a different day entirely. "But Cassie, before we do, I think you ought to sit with what's actually still sitting in that truck bed outside. You've got a letter telling you the money's not the point. You've got a footlocker you haven't even opened yet. And now you've got a second letter waiting on a name neither of us has heard your grandfather say in years." He held her gaze steady. "That's a lot to carry in one day. No shame in slowing down." Cassie folded the letter carefully back along its worn creases and held it against her chest for a moment, the way you'd hold something breakable. "I've been slow my whole life, Ross," she said, "waiting for somebody to hand me a reason to stop. I don't think I want to wait anymore." Outside, through the study window, she could see the truck bed, where the footlocker sat, wrapped in an old moving blanket, dirt-crusted and patient, holding whatever her grandfather had buried, and never explained to anyone but a stranger neither of them had met. Somewhere beyond that, in Ross's own house, a second letter waited with a name on it that had left her grandfather angrier every time he showed up. She stood, letter still in hand, and for the first time all day, she didn't feel like the granddaughter who'd been handed the joke of the estate. She felt like someone about to find out exactly what she'd inherited. Ross's place was quieter than the farmhouse had been, and stranger for it. A smaller house, a smaller yard, but somehow it held more weight in it as Ross disappeared into the back bedroom and came out 5 minutes later with a plain manila envelope, soft at the corners, sealed with a strip of yellowed tape that had long since lost its stick. "Haven't touched it since the day he gave it to me," Ross said, setting it on the kitchen table beside the footlocker, which still sat wrapped in its moving blanket like something recovering from surgery. "Didn't want to. Felt like it wasn't mine to be curious about." Dottie set out coffee nobody drank and then, without a word, took herself out to the garden, leaving Cassie and Ross alone at the table with 2 unopened things between them. One holding whatever wealth her grandfather had buried, the other holding whatever truth he'd been too careful to say out loud while he was alive. "Which first?" Ross asked. Cassie looked at the footlocker a long moment. "The letter told me the money's not the point," she said. "I think I believe him. So, the letter first. Whatever's in that box, I want to already understand it before I see it." Ross slid the envelope across the table. The tape gave way easily, brittle with age, and inside was a single folded page, shorter than the first letter, the handwriting tighter, like it had been written fast, in one sitting, by a man who wanted to get it down before he changed his mind. "Cassie, if you're reading this," Ross finally handed it over, "which means you've earned it in whatever way I couldn't have predicted but always hoped for. I owe you the truth about Everett, and I've put this off longer than I should have, so I'll say it plain, the way I should have said everything plain. Always. Everett was my brother. Not my cousin, my brother, 3 years younger, and for a long stretch of our lives, the person I was closest to on this earth. We built the first version of that silo together in 1968, back when this was still our father's ground, and neither one of us owned a single acre outright. We were going to run this place as partners. That was the plan for a long time. It didn't work out that way. There was money. There's always money in the end, isn't there? A loan we'd taken out together to buy equipment, and a bad year, and then another bad year on top of it, and Everett wanted to sell off the South 40 to cover what we owed. I wouldn't do it. I told him that ground wasn't for selling, not ever, not for any amount, and I meant it, the way a stubborn young man means things, without much thought for what it had cost. We said things to each other that year I've spent the rest of my life regretting the exact wording of. He left not long after. Took what savings he had and went west, and I didn't hear from him again for almost 11 years. When he did come back, it wasn't to reconcile. It was because he'd made money, real money, out in Nevada, in ways I never fully understood, and he never fully explained. And he wanted back in on the farm. Wanted his half returned to him, the half he said I'd cheated him out of by refusing to sell when he'd asked. I didn't see it that way. I still don't. Some days, though I've had a long time to turn it over, and I won't pretend I come out looking entirely clean in the turning. He came around a handful of times after that, over the years, always asking for the same thing, always leaving angrier than he arrived. The last time was maybe 8 years back. He told me he was done asking, and that whatever I owed him, I could settle it with God instead, because he was tired of settling it with me. I never told your mother any of this. Never told your cousins. The money in that footlocker. I want you to understand exactly what it is, because it matters more than the number attached to it. It's Everett's half. The share of this farm he asked me for, and I refused to give him, converted over the years into cash I never spent and never touched, sitting under that silo floor because I couldn't bring myself to either send it to him or admit out loud what it meant that I'd kept it. I don't know if Everett's alive. I don't know where he'd be if he is. I'm asking you, Cassie, not because you owe him anything, you never even met the man, but because I think you're the only one in this family with the kind of stubbornness it'd take to actually finish something I started and never had the courage to finish myself. Find out. If he's alive, give him his share, or as much of it as still makes sense after all these years. If he's not, find whoever he left behind, and do the same. I built that silo with my brother's hands as much as mine. It only felt right that whatever came up out of the ground beneath it should go, in the end, to make that right. Cassie set the letter down slowly, her throat tight, in a way that had nothing to do with the dust and grime still caked under her fingernails from that morning's work. Ross was quiet across the table, his jaw working like he was chewing on something that didn't sit easy. He never told me any of that, Ross said finally. 11 years working alongside the man, and he never once mentioned a brother. He said he wasn't good at playing, Cassie said. When it mattered most. No, Ross agreed. He surely wasn't. They sat with it a while, the coffee going cold, Dottie's silhouette moving between rows of tomato plants out the kitchen window, the footlocker sitting patient and unopened between them, like it could wait as long as it needed to. Cassie thought about her own mother, gone since she was 9, and the particular loneliness of never being told the parts of a family's story that might have explained why everyone in it behaved the way they did. She thought about Trent and Dale laughing about the silo in the lawyer's office, having no idea they were laughing about a 50-year-old wound their own grandfather had never once let them see. "I have to find him," Cassie said. "Everett, if he's alive." "Man could be anywhere," Ross said. "Nevada, if he's even still out there, could be passed on himself, for all any of us know. Then I'll find whoever he left behind." She picked the letter back up, folding it with the same careful reverence she'd given the first one. "My grandfather asked me to finish something. I don't intend to be the kind of person who reads a letter like that and does nothing." Ross studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into the lines of his weathered face. "You know," he said, "your grandfather used to say the Whitfield stubbornness skipped his own son-in-law entirely and went straight to whoever married into it least expecting it. I always figured he meant your mother. Sitting here now, I'm starting to think he might have meant you." Cassie almost smiled at that, the first real almost smile since the lawyer's office that morning, but it faded fast, chased off by the weight of the footlocker, still sitting unopened on the table, and by a question that had been building in her chest since the second sentence of that letter, and hadn't found anywhere to land yet. "Ross," she said, "if Everett's still alive somewhere, and if he finds out I've got what's rightfully half his sitting in a truck bed outside your house, what's to stop him from coming to take it himself, the same way he tried with my grandfather?" Ross didn't have an answer for that. Neither, for the moment, did she. They opened the footlocker on the kitchen table because by that point neither of them had the patience left to wait for anything else. The padlock wouldn't budge, fused solid with 50 years of rust. So Ross fetched a pair of bolt cutters from his shed, and it took 3 tries before the hasp finally snapped with a sound like a gunshot that had Dottie hurrying back in from the garden to see what had happened. The lid stuck at first, swollen shut by decades underground, and then gave all at once when Cassie worked a flathead screwdriver into the seam and levered it up. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle and dark with age, were bundles of cash, old bills, some of a style Cassie didn't even recognize, banded together with paper strips that had crumbled to dust at the edges. Beneath the cash, a smaller bundle of documents, a hand-drawn ledger, decades of entries in her grandfather's shaky arithmetic, tracking a figure that grew, year after year, with notations she didn't fully understand. E's share, 1979 crop, and E's share plus interest, held running down the page in a column that never once got smaller. Dottie did the counting, because her hands were steadier than either Cassie's or Ross's by that point. It took her the better part of 20 minutes, laid out in stacks across the kitchen table, before she sat back and said the number out loud. Enough, Cassie understood distantly, to change the entire shape of her life, and yet somehow the number mattered less to her in that moment than the ledger sitting beside it, proof in her grandfather's own hand that he'd spent 50 years keeping a debt he never had the courage to pay. "That's Everett's," Cassie said, staring at the stacks like they might rearrange themselves into something easier to hold. "All of it. That's what Grandpa wanted me to find him and give back." "Some of it's yours too," Dottie said gently. "He didn't split it that way in the letter, but I doubt he'd begrudge you keeping a portion, considering what he left you to find it with." Cassie didn't answer that right away. She was still looking at the ledger, at 50 years of a stubborn man quietly keeping account of a wrong he'd never once admitted to fixing. It was Ross's phone that broke the moment. a short, sharp buzz against the kitchen table, and when he glanced at it, his face changed in a way that made Cassie's stomach drop before he'd said a single word. "It's Dale," he said. "Texting to ask if I've been out at the silo. Says somebody mentioned seeing my truck parked out there yesterday evening." "Why would he care?" Ross set the phone down slowly. "Because your stepbrothers might have thought the silo was worthless yesterday morning, but a broken concrete floor and 2 trucks parked out there overnight is the kind of thing that makes even a careless man start wondering what he laughed away too quick." He looked at her, something grim settling into his expression. "Cassie, I think you'd best get that footlocker somewhere secure. And soon. Word travels fast in a county this size, and it won't take Dale long to put together that you didn't drive out there twice in one day for the scenery." As if summoned by the thought itself, gravel crunched in the driveway outside. A truck engine, familiar in the particular rattle only a specific make and model produces, and through the kitchen window, Cassie watched Dale Whitfield's pickup roll to a stop behind Ross's Ford, blocking it in. "Stay calm," Ross said quietly, already moving toward the door. "Let me handle the talking." Dale climbed out, looking like a man, trying hard to appear casual, and not quite managing it, jaw tight, eyes flicking past Ross, toward the house, toward the kitchen window, where he could probably see, if he looked close enough, 3 people standing around a table, with an old military footlocker sitting open on top of it. "Ross," Dale said, too friendly. "Didn't expect to find you out here on a workday. Wasn't aware I answered to your schedule," Ross said, not unkindly, but with an edge underneath it that hadn't been there a moment before. "What can I do for you, Dale? Heard you were out at the old silo yesterday, and this morning, from the look of the dirt on your truck bed." Dale's eyes went past him again, more openly this time, toward the window. "That true?" Cassie asked for some help looking over what she inherited. "Seemed like a reasonable thing for a neighbor to do." "Funny," Dale said, "because somebody also mentioned the silo floor's been torn half to pieces. Now, I don't much care what my stepsister does with a rusted grain bin nobody's used in 15 years. But if there's something on that property worth tearing up a concrete floor for, I'd think that's information the whole family ought to have, seeing as the estate hasn't fully cleared probate yet, and anything found on inherited land before that clears could technically still be considered part of the shared estate." It was, Cassie realized with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly the kind of thing a man says when he's already talked to a lawyer of his own. She stepped out onto the porch before Ross could answer for her, footlocker forgotten on the table behind her, the weight of her grandfather's letter still folded in her back pocket, like something she could draw strength from just by knowing it was there. "Dale," she said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "The will named that acre and everything on it as mine, specifically, by name, in writing. The acre," Dale said, "not necessarily whatever happens to be buried underneath it. That's the kind of gray area a probate judge might have real interest in, Cassie. And you know as well as I do that Trent and I could make this expensive and slow for you if we wanted to." "Would you?" she asked. "Is that really who you want to be about this?" Something flickered across Dale's face. Not quite guilt, but something adjacent to it. The discomfort of a man who'd rehearsed a harder version of himself in his truck on the drive over and was finding it harder to hold on to in person. He didn't answer right away. "I'm not saying I want a fight," he said finally. "I'm saying Trent's already talking to somebody about it, and I think you'd be smart to have your own lawyer before this goes any further. That's all. That's the only reason I drove out." He got back in his truck without waiting for a response, backed carefully around Ross's Ford, and pulled away down the gravel road with a slowness that felt more like a threat than the visit itself had. Cassie stood on the porch a long moment after the sound of his engine had faded, watching the dust he'd kicked up settle back down over the road. He's not wrong about one thing, Ross said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Probate's not closed. If Trent's already lawyered up about this, you're going to need more than a handwritten letter and my word to hold on to what's rightfully yours. Cassie thought of the ledger sitting on the kitchen table, 50 years of her grandfather's careful, guilty arithmetic, and of a brother named Everett, who might still be out there somewhere, entitled to a debt nobody but a dead man had ever intended to pay. Then I guess, she said, we'd better find a lawyer before Trent finds a reason to take this away from both me and Everett at once. The lawyer Cassie found wasn't Feld. She didn't trust anyone still on cordial terms with the family's estate business, but a woman 2 towns over named Priya Anand, who specialized in probate disputes and who listened to the whole story, footlocker and ledger and half-buried brother included, without so much as blinking. Your grandfather named the property to you by description and by name, Priya said, tapping a pen against a legal pad covered in notes. 1 acre, the silo, everything appurtenant to it. That word, appurtenant, is going to matter a great deal if this goes in front of a judge. It generally means whatever's attached to or found on the property goes with it. Your stepbrother's argument that anything discovered before probate closes reverts to the shared estate is a stretch. Not impossible to argue, but a stretch. Judges don't love it when families try to claw back specifically bequeathed items after the fact. So we're fine, Cassie said, wanting badly for it to be that simple. You're likely fine, Priya said, which was a different thing entirely, but likely costs money to prove if Trent's serious about pushing it. And from what you're describing, I'd guess he is. She set the pen down. There's something else, though, and I want to be straightforward with you about it. This ledger, your grandfather's own handwriting, tracking a debt to a brother. If that surfaces in a courtroom, it complicates things. Not in a way that hurts your claim to the property, but it opens a question about who else might have a legitimate claim to what's inside that footlocker. Everett, Cassie said. If he's alive, and if he can be found, and if he can prove the relationship. Yes, your grandfather's own letter is essentially a signed confession of an unpaid debt. That's not nothing, legally. Priya studied her for a moment. Most people in your position would burn that ledger and never mention Everett to a soul. I take it that's not what you're planning to do. No, Cassie said, without hesitation, surprising herself with how little the answer cost her. My grandfather asked me to find him. I'm not going to unask that, just because it'd be easier. Priya's expression shifted, something like respect, brief and professional, but real. Then let's talk about how to do this in a way that protects the property first and finds Everett second. Because trying to do both at once, badly, is how people lose things they shouldn't. The plan, once Priya laid it out, was straightforward enough on paper. File to have the acre and its contents formally excluded from the remaining probate dispute, using the will's specific language as grounds, while separately, and privately, outside of any court filing, Cassie could pursue finding Everett or his descendants on her own timeline. Without that search becoming public record, Trent could use to argue the money was still unsettled estate business. It should have felt like a relief. Instead, driving back out to the silo that evening with Ross, Cassie found the file sitting differently in her chest. Not fear exactly, but a low, steady hum of pressure, the sense of holding something fragile in a house that had started to feel less safe than it had 2 days ago. The silo itself, in the fading light, looked exactly as it had left them. The shattered floor, the old wood scattered where they'd pried it up, the raw pit beneath, still visible like a wound that hadn't closed. Cassie stood at the threshold a long moment, one hand on the cold, rusted doorframe, and let herself feel, for the first time since the lawyer's office, the full weight of everything that had happened in 3 days. A grandfather's silence broken open, a brother's 50-year-old wound exposed, a stepbrother circling with a lawyer of his own. "You've gone quiet," Ross said, coming to stand beside her. "I keep thinking about the letter," Cassie said. "The first one, where he said the money wasn't the point, that the point was giving me a reason to stay somewhere long enough to build something real." She looked around the silo, at the rust and the ruin and the raw earth beneath the broken floor. "And now I've got Trent threatening to take the land, and Everett's money sitting in a lawyer's safe, and I don't know that I'm building anything yet. I just feel like I'm holding on." "Holding on's the first part of building," Ross said. "Now, don't discount it." They worked the rest of the evening clearing debris from the silo floor, not because it needed doing that night, but because it gave both of them something to do with their hands while the weight of the day settled. It was nearly dark when Cassie's phone buzzed in her pocket. An unfamiliar number, area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer instead. "Is this Cassie Hartwell?" The voice was a woman's, older, careful in a way that put Cassie instantly on guard. "My name is Louise Calder. No relation to your Ross. Different family entirely. Small world. I'm calling because my late husband's name was Everett Whitfield, and a friend of a friend mentioned there was some kind of inquiry going around Willow Bend about a man by that name, and a farm, and I thought," the voice caught, just slightly, "well, I thought I'd better call before I let this go unanswered." Cassie's grip tightened on the phone so hard her knuckles went white. Beside her, Ross had gone still, watching her face with an intensity that told her he'd guessed exactly who was on the line. "Everett was your husband," Cassie managed. "Was. He passed 8 years ago now," Louise said. "Heart, in his sleep, out here in Reno. Never talked much about his family back in Nebraska. Not to me, not to our daughter, not to anybody, not in all the years I knew him. I always got the sense there was something he'd left behind that he couldn't quite make peace with." A pause, careful, searching. "Are you family? Is that why you're asking?" Cassie closed her eyes, standing in the dark mouth of the silo her grandfather had built with his own hands and his brother's. 50 years and a lifetime of silence between two men who'd never found their way back to each other before it was too late. "I'm your husband's niece," she said, "and I think I have something that belongs to your family. Something my grandfather should have given him a long time ago." The line went quiet for a long moment, long enough that Cassie thought the call might have dropped, before Louise spoke again, her voice thick with something that sounded, even across that much distance, like 50 years of an unanswered question, finally starting to close. "I think," Louise said slowly, "you'd better tell me everything." Louise talked for nearly an hour that first call, and by the end of it, Cassie understood two things clearly. That Everett Whitfield had spent the back half of his life building a modest, honest business restoring old furniture in Reno, never touching a cent of unexplained money, never once suggesting to his wife or daughter that he was owed anything by anybody, and that he had, according to Louise, kept a single photograph on his workshop wall until the day he died. A faded picture of two young men standing in front of a half-built silo, arms slung over each other's shoulders, squinting into a Nebraska sun neither of them had any idea would set on their friendship so completely. "He never took it down," Louise said. "Never explained who the other man was either. Not really. Just said, 'That's my brother. We don't talk anymore.' I asked him why, once, early on. He said it was a debt neither one of them knew how to pay, and he didn't want to talk about it further, and I loved him enough to let that be the end of it." Her voice had gone soft with old grief. "I wish I hadn't. I wish I'd pushed." Cassie promised to call again once she'd spoken with her own lawyer, and Louise, for her part, promised to talk to her and Everett's daughter, a woman named Marianne, 34, living in Sacramento, who Louise said had asked about her father's family exactly once, as a teenager, and never again, after being told there wasn't much to tell. It should have felt like the beginning of something whole. Instead, it took less than 3 days for it to start feeling like the beginning of something else entirely. Trent's lawyer filed first, a motion to freeze any disposition of property or assets discovered on the disputed parcel, pending a full accounting, which Priya explained, grimly, meant Cassie couldn't legally give Louise or Marianne a single dollar until the matter cleared court, however long that took. Then came the second blow, smaller but somehow worse. A reporter from the county paper, tipped off by someone, Cassie suspected Dale, though she couldn't prove it, ran a short item under the headline, "Local Estate Dispute Turns Up Buried Fortune," and within a day, half of Willow Bend seemed to know more about her business than she'd told even Dottie. She was standing in line at the feed store where she still, technically, worked, when a woman she barely recognized asked her, not unkindly, but not gently either, whether it was true she'd found $100,000 buried in a silo. Cassie didn't correct the number. She just paid for her coffee and left, hands shaking on the drive back to the Calders, and it was there, alone in her car on the gravel shoulder 1/2 mile from the farm, that the last 3 days finally caught up with her, all at once. She cried for the first time since the lawyer's office, not gently, not the composed kind of crying she'd allowed herself in front of Ross and Dottie, but the raw, ugly kind that came from somewhere she'd been keeping locked since she was 9 years old, and her mother had died, and nobody in this family had ever quite known what to do with her afterward. She cried because she was tired of being the punchline of somebody else's joke about an inheritance. She cried because a woman named Louise had spent 50 years married to a man carrying a wound Cassie's own grandfather had put there and never fixed. She cried because some small, exhausted part of her wondered if she should just let Trent have it, the silo, the money, all of it, and go back to stocking shelves somewhere nobody knew her name. It was Dottie who found her 20 minutes later, having driven out looking when Cassie hadn't come home, and it was Dottie who didn't say a word at first, just got in the passenger seat and sat with her until the worst of it passed. "You want to know something," Dottie said finally, "about your grandfather, that Ross never told you, because Ross doesn't much like talking about the hard years." Cassie wiped her face and nodded. There was a stretch, back in the 80s, when this farm nearly went under. Everybody in the county knew it. Walt lost half his herd to a bad winter, then lost the next 2 years' corn to drought, and for about 18 months he was about as close to losing everything as a man can get without actually losing it. Dottie looked out at the fields, gold and quiet in the afternoon light. You know what he did? He didn't quit. He didn't sell off what he could to make it easier. He just kept showing up to the same ground every single morning, doing the next necessary thing, whether or not it felt like it was working. Took him 3 more years after that, before things turned around for good. "What's your point?" "My point," Dottie said, "is that you come from a man who knew how to keep going when everything in him wanted to stop. That's not something you have to go looking for in yourself, Cassie. It's already in there. You've been doing it since the day you walked into that lawyer's office and didn't run." Cassie sat with that a long moment, the last of the crying settling into something steadier, something closer to resolve than despair. "Priya says I can't give Louise or Marianne anything until probate clears," she said. "Could be months." "Then it's months," Dottie said simply. "You've waited this long to know the truth about your own family. A few more months waiting to make it right isn't going to undo what you've already found." They drove back to the farm as the light went long and orange across the fields, and it was there, pulling into the driveway, that Cassie saw something that stopped her cold. Her own car, the one she'd left parked at the silo 2 days before while helping Ross haul the last of the debris, sitting instead in Ross's own driveway, and beside it, unfamiliar, a rental sedan with California plates. A woman was standing near the porch, 30-something, dark-haired, arms crossed against the evening chill, looking equal parts nervous and determined. "That's not someone from around here," Dottie said quietly. Cassie's heart had already started climbing into her throat before the woman turned, before she got close enough to see the particular set of her jaw, the particular shape of her eyes, features Cassie recognized instantly, impossibly, 'cause she'd seen a version of them just 3 days earlier, worn slightly differently, in her own grandfather's face. "Cassie Hartwell?" the woman asked, voice unsteady. "My mother told me not to just show up like this. I'm Marianne. I think we might be cousins." Marianne didn't come inside right away. She stood in the driveway a long moment, arms still crossed, looking at Cassie with an expression that seemed to be doing the same math Cassie was, trying to find the shape of a stranger's face in a family she'd never been allowed to know. "I'm sorry," Marianne said finally. "I know this is strange. My mother called me 2 days ago and told me things about my father I'd spent my whole life not knowing, and I just—" She gave a short, helpless laugh. "I got on a plane. I didn't think it through past that." "You don't need to apologize," Cassie said, and meant it more than the words probably conveyed. "I've been trying to find you. I just didn't expect you to find me first." Dottie, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who'd spent 40 years knowing exactly when a kitchen table was needed, ushered them both inside before another word could be said in the cold. Ross came in not long after, and for a while the four of them sat together over coffee, neither Cassie nor Marianne touched, while Cassie told the whole story again. The will, the silo, the concrete floor, the 2 letters, the ledger tracking a debt across 50 patient years. Marianne listened, with her hands wrapped tight around her mug, and when Cassie got to the part about the photograph, the one Louise had described, 2 young men and a half-built silo, kept on a workshop wall until the day Everett died, something in her seemed to come loose. "He had that same picture in his office," Marianne said quietly. "I used to ask him about it when I was a kid. 'Who's that with you, Dad?' And he'd just say, 'That's somebody I used to know,' and change the subject so fast, I learned not to ask again." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed, and didn't stop. "I spent my whole childhood thinking my dad just didn't have any family, like he'd come from nowhere. And this whole time there was a farm, and a brother, and—" She gestured helplessly at the room around her. "All of this." "He didn't come from nowhere," Cassie said. "He came from here, from this ground. My grandfather's letter said they built the original silo together, the 2 of them, before anything went wrong between them." "Can I see it, the letter?" Cassie hesitated only a moment, before pulling both letters from where she'd taken to keeping them, folded in the inside pocket of her jacket, and handing them across the table. She watched Marianne read them the way she herself had read them the first time, slowly, then faster, then slowly again at the parts that clearly cost something to get through, her free hand pressed flat against her mouth, by the time she reached the line about the silo being the only thing Walter had ever built with his own hands and his brother's. "He never got to read this," Marianne said, when she finally looked up. "My dad. He died not knowing any of it, not knowing his brother had spent 50 years keeping the money instead of spending it, not knowing he'd been trying, in his own broken way, to make it right eventually." Her voice cracked. "He died thinking nobody on this side of the family ever thought about him again." The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence usually did. Cassie thought of her own mother, gone at 9 years old, and the particular ache of growing up without ever fully knowing what had been lost, not just a person, but the whole shape of a story that person had been carrying. She reached across the table and took Marianne's hand, an instinct more than a decision. "He was wrong about that," Cassie said. My grandfather thought about him every single day. He just never found the courage to say it out loud until it was too late to say it to the right person. She held Marianne's gaze steady. I don't want that to be the end of the story. I don't think either of us has to let it be. It was Ross who finally broke the moment, clearing his throat in the careful way of a man about to say something practical in a room full of feeling. There's still the matter of Trent, he said, and the court filing. Priya's going to need to know Marianne's here, and that there's a legitimate claim on the other side of this now. That's going to change the whole shape of what Trent's lawyer can argue. How so? Marianne asked. Because right now, Cassie said slowly, working it out as she said it, Trent's whole argument is that anything found on the property before probate closes should revert to the shared estate, split between him and Dale. But if there's a documented, provable debt to a third party, to your father's estate, to you, that's not really estate money to split at all. That's a debt my grandfather owed, sitting in escrow until it's paid to the person it's actually owed to. She looked at Marianne with something like relief dawning slow across her face. You being here, being real, being findable, that might be the thing that actually protects all of this. Not just for me. For you too. Marianne let out a breath that seemed to carry weeks of tension behind it. So, I didn't just fly out here to complicate your court case. You flew out here, Dottie said gently, to finish something two brothers started and never got to finish themselves. I'd call that the opposite of complicating it. They sat late into the evening working out the practical shape of what came next. A call to Priya first thing in the morning, a formal claim Marianne would need to file, establishing her father's estate as the rightful recipient of the ledgered debt. A plan to bring Louise into it as well, once the legal footing was steadier. It was well past dark by the time Marianne finally stood to leave for her motel in town, and at the door she paused, looking back at Cassie with an expression that had softened considerably from the nervous, braced woman who'd arrived in the driveway hours before. For what it's worth, Marianne said, I think our grandfather, I can call him that now, right? I think he'd be glad it was you who found all this, not Trent, not Dale, you. Cassie thought of the will, of the lawyer's tired voice reading her name last, of Dale's careless laugh in that cold office 3 days ago, that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different life. I think he waited on purpose, Cassie said, for someone who'd actually finish what he couldn't. Outside, the porch light caught the shape of Marianne's rental car pulling away down the gravel road, and behind it, further out past the fields, the dark silhouette of the silo stood against the last blue light of evening. No longer, Cassie thought, a joke or a throwaway or an insult dressed up as an inheritance, but something closer to what her grandfather had always meant it to be. A foundation, finally, after 50 years, being built on the way it was always supposed to be. The storm came 3 weeks later, the night before the probate hearing that would decide, once and for all, whether the silo and everything beneath it belonged to Cassie the way her grandfather had intended. Nobody had predicted it would be that bad. The forecast had called for scattered thunderstorms, nothing more. But by 10 that night, the wind had picked up to something closer to a roar, and Cassie stood at the window of the small rented room she'd finally taken in town. Her own place now, first lease she'd signed in over a year, watching sheets of rain turn the streetlights into smears of orange. Her phone rang at 10:40. Ross, his voice tight in a way she'd only heard once before, the day Dale showed up in his driveway. Silo roof's coming apart, he said. I drove past on my way back from town. One of the panels tore loose, whole sections flapping, like it's fixing to come down entirely. With that concrete floor still exposed underneath, and the pit not properly filled back in yet. I'm coming, Cassie said, already reaching for her boots. Cassie, it's not safe out there tonight. The wind alone. I'm coming, Ross. She drove the 11 minutes to the South 40 with her wipers useless against the rain, hydroplaning once on the county road, badly enough that her heart lodged somewhere near her throat for a full 10 seconds before the tires caught again. When she pulled up, Ross was already there, flashlight in hand, staring up at a roof panel torn half loose and hammering against the silo's frame in the wind, the sound like something being beaten to death. "If that comes down," Ross shouted over the wind, "it could crack straight through what's left of that floor, maybe compromise the whole structure. Insurance won't cover storm damage on something not fully assessed yet, and if the county inspector rules the structure unsafe before the hearing tomorrow, Trent's lawyer could argue the property's not fit to be transferred as is, could delay everything, maybe give him an opening to argue for demolition and a straight cash split instead." 6 months ago, Cassie would have stood there and let someone else decide what happened next. She'd spent her whole life being the one things happened to: a mother lost, a family that never quite made room for her, an inheritance handed over as a joke. But she'd spent 3 weeks now learning things she hadn't known she had in her. How to read Priya's filings closely enough to catch an error the first time. How to talk down a reporter who'd shown up looking for a more dramatic quote than the truth actually offered. How to sit across a table from Marianne and Louise and build something steady out of 50 years of silence. "There's rope in the truck bed," she shouted back. "And that come-along you keep behind the seat." Ross stared at her. "You're not climbing that ladder in this wind. I'm not climbing anything. We're pulling the panel down from the ground before it tears loose entirely and does more damage coming off than staying half attached." She was already moving toward the truck, memory pulling up something she'd half absorbed weeks ago, watching Ross rig a fence line after a windstorm. Anchor a line to the base of the panel, run it through the come-along, use the truck to draw it down slow instead of letting it snap free on its own. It took the better part of 40 minutes, soaked through and half-blind in the rain, but they got the panel down without it tearing the roof frame apart, and by the time the worst of the storm passed and Ross's headlights swept over the silo's ruined but standing shape, Cassie understood, with a clarity that felt earned rather than given, that she'd just done something her grandfather would have recognized in himself: the stubborn, unglamorous work of holding on to a thing worth keeping, one difficult decision at a time. The hearing the next morning went, in the end, the way Priya had hoped. Judge Reyes reviewed the will's language, the ledger, the letters, Marianne's filed claim on her father's behalf, and ruled cleanly. The acre and its contents belonged to Cassie, as specifically bequeathed, and the documented debt to Everett Whitfield's estate would be honored in full, held in trust for Marianne and Louise, separate from any claim Trent or Dale could make on the shared estate. Trent, to his credit, didn't fight it further once the ruling came down. Dale never mentioned the silo again. 6 months later, on a clear October afternoon, Cassie stood at the base of a rebuilt silo. New roof, reinforced floor, the old rusted door replaced with one that opened smooth and quiet, and watched Marianne's daughter, 9 years old and fearless, chase Ross's grandkids through the surrounding field, while Louise sat with Dottie on 2 folding chairs, laughing about something Cassie couldn't quite hear from that distance. The silo wasn't a monument anymore. It was a workshop now, Cassie's own furniture restoration business, the first steady thing she'd ever built with her own 2 hands, the same trade Everett had spent his own quiet decades practicing 3 states away, neither of them knowing, until now, how much they'd had in common all along. She thought sometimes about that lawyer's office, about Dale's careless laugh, about a will that had seemed, for one long afternoon, like the cruelest joke her family had ever played on her. She understood now what her grandfather had known all along, that the smallest, most overlooked thing you're ever handed can turn out to be the only thing worth having, if you're willing to do the work of finding out why. If there's one thing this story taught me, It's that the inheritance that matters most isn't always the one that looks like something on paper. Sometimes it's just a reason to stay and the stubbornness to build something real out of it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear which part stayed with you. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this one.